left to die in the desert for being infertile, until one brave father defied the odds to save her. David Kaine's transport rumbled across the barren plateau, its engine groaning under the harsh sun of Proxima's second moon. The twin suns of Proxima Thjasse beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows across the cracked, dry landscape. Sweat trickled down his neck, soaking his already damp utility shirt. The ship's cooling system wheezed with a sound that told David it was about to give out completely. "Piece of junk," he muttered under his breath, slapping the console in frustration. "Hold together just a little longer," he whispered, his knuckles white against the dashboard. 6 months had passed since Elena's death, and everything seemed to be falling apart. His ship, his homestead, his life. The only thing keeping him going were his 3 daughters. 3 bright stars in an otherwise dark, desolate world. Without them, David didn't know how he would have kept going. He'd lost everything else. They were his reason to get up every morning, to keep pushing through. He hadn't planned on witnessing an execution today. He had only left to scout the area for potential mineral deposits, hoping to find something that might help with their dwindling farm income. The crops were failing, and the money from his small mineral exploration efforts was barely enough to cover the bills. If he could find more minerals, maybe, just maybe, he could make enough to keep his family afloat. But as he crested the ridge and the sight below froze his blood, David realized that no amount of money could ever change what he was about to witness. Down below, a group of Verdani, tall, green-skinned humanoids, stood in a ceremonial circle. Their long limbs stretched out in perfect symmetry. In the center, a woman was being buried alive in the scorching desert sands. Only her head remained exposed, her face frozen in an expression of terror. David could see it from this distance, the desperation in her wide, almond-shaped eyes. Her skin was a vibrant green, shimmering like polished jade under the intense heat of the twin suns. She looked so small, so vulnerable, her body pale beneath the sand as though she were already a ghost. David's heart raced, and for a moment, he couldn't move. His eyes locked onto hers and something inside him snapped. He could feel her pain, her fear, the sense of helplessness that came with being trapped. The wind howled around him, the sounds of distant predators rising as the night drew nearer. But all David could hear was the steady beat of his own heart. It seemed to be the only sound in the universe. He had seen the Verdani rituals before, but never so up close. The Verdani were known for their strict social structure, their rigid rules about population control. For them, reproduction was sacred. Those who failed to meet the fertility standards were discarded, literally. This woman was being punished for the crime of infertility, a crime punishable by death. The sand-covered desert was their execution ground. David's throat tightened. His hands gripped the wheel as he fought the urge to turn away. He had no reason to get involved. It wasn't his problem. This was their way, their customs. He could just keep driving and pretend he hadn't seen anything. He could go home, back to his daughters, where it was safe. But something inside him, a part of him he hadn't been able to ignore since Elena's death, told him to act. To do something, he couldn't just walk away. The ship lurched as he powered it down. The engine's protest seemed to echo his thoughts. "Get out of here, David," his mind screamed. But the decision was already made. He couldn't leave her there. The woman's eyes had locked onto his with an intensity that seemed to reach beyond the physical world. She knew he was watching. She knew someone had seen her fate. David killed the engines, his eyes still fixed on her, and grabbed the binoculars sitting beside him. He needed to see more clearly, to understand what was happening, what he could do. He zoomed in, and the image was like a punch to the gut. The female was trembling, her eyes wide with terror. Her lips cracked from dehydration. She was still alive, but only just. The sand had begun to fill in around her, suffocating her slowly. David could hear her gasps, though they were faint, almost drowned out by the wind. He cursed under his breath. He didn't know what he was doing, but he couldn't just sit here and watch her die. He knew the Verdani customs. He knew the moment they left, the scavengers would come, the predators would feast. He knew she didn't have much time. David's hand hovered over the controls, and for a moment he considered turning around. It was foolish, reckless. He had 3 young daughters at home. They needed him. They depended on him. But he had already made the decision. With a sigh that came from deep within his chest, David powered up the transport again. The small, battered ship groaned in protest as he turned it back toward the ridge. He didn't know how he was going to do it. He didn't know how he could possibly help her and keep his family safe. But the thought of leaving her to die alone in the sand was more unbearable than anything else. He wouldn't do it. Not today. As David steered the transport across the desert, his heart pounded in his chest. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. How would he get to her without being seen? How could he bring her back to his ship? What would he do if the Verdani caught him? They wouldn't hesitate to kill him. They wouldn't care that he had 3 daughters at home. To them he was nothing, just another human, but David had no choice. He couldn't turn back. Not now. The transport's wheels kicked up sand as David drove toward the site, his mind already planning. He could see the glow of the setting suns on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. He had to hurry. He had to make sure he was back before it was too late. The woman, whoever she was, needed him. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, he needed her too. The Verdani might be ruthless, but David Kaine was willing to risk everything for one life. Because sometimes, even in a world as cruel as this one, saving a life was worth more than anything else, and he wasn't going to let her die. Not on his watch. David's fingers tightened on the wheel as the transport sped across the desert, the dry, cracked earth blurring beneath him. The winds kicked up a storm of dust, and the stifling heat seemed to close in around him. He glanced at the horizon, where the setting suns of Proxima Thjasse painted the sky in shades of orange and red, a reminder of how close the night was. The shadows were lengthening, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. The predators would soon awaken, and when they did, they would find the woman buried in the sand. If he didn't act now, she would be gone. His mind raced, every second feeling like an eternity. He was a father, a widower, a man who had spent 6 months trying to rebuild his shattered life, and every decision he had made until now had been to protect his daughters. They needed him. But this was different. This wasn't just a matter of survival. It was a matter of right and wrong. David had never been one to shy away from danger. He'd faced battles, fought in wars, and seen horrors that would haunt most men for the rest of their lives. But this wasn't a battle with weapons. This wasn't a war fought on foreign soil. This was a decision between choosing what was easy, what was safe, or choosing to do something right, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He could hear Elena's voice in his head. Do the right thing, David. Always do the right thing. The memory of her laugh, her soft smile, reminded him why he had come here in the first place. She had been the scientist, the dreamer, the one who believed that life, even in the harshest of environments, had a deeper purpose. And now, in the midst of the desert's cruelty, it was his turn to make that choice. He could turn back, live in fear of the consequences, and leave her to die. Or he could do something that in the end might change the course of his entire life. David's mind settled on the path forward. He wasn't just rescuing a woman. He wasn't just challenging the Verdani. He was choosing to take a stand against an unjust system, a system that condemned the weak, that buried those who couldn't contribute to their warped version of society. His hands gripped the wheel, and he slammed his foot down harder on the accelerator, pushing the ship faster toward the burial site. As the transport bounced over the uneven terrain, David's thoughts turned to his daughters. The 3 little girls who were waiting for him at home, trusting him to keep them safe. They had already lost their mother, and now he was about to put them in danger again. But he had no other choice. He couldn't just let her die. The woman in the sand who had been condemned for infertility was no different from his own daughters. No matter the species, no matter the differences in biology or culture, the idea of a life being discarded because it didn't meet some arbitrary standard was something he could not accept. He had to do something. He couldn't be the man who looked away. He wouldn't be. David reached the ridge where he had first seen her. The burial site lay below, a patch of open sand where the Verdani had left her to die. The group of towering humanoids was already departing, their sleek vehicles disappearing over the horizon as the last rays of the suns faded. The female was still there, half buried, her head barely visible, her large eyes locked onto his position. She was alive, but barely. David's heart hammered in his chest as he killed the engines and braked hard. His ship groaned in protest, but David wasn't listening. He grabbed his binoculars and surveyed the scene again. looking for any signs of life, any sign that he hadn't come here for nothing. Her eyes, those desperate violet eyes, were still open, and in that moment something in David's chest tightened. He couldn't turn back. He wouldn't. David's mind raced through the options, calculating the risk. He had no plan, no strategy. There was no foolproof way to get to her and save her. The Verdani were relentless. If they saw him, they would kill him without a second thought. But if he did nothing, she would die, buried beneath the sand, just like so many before her. He had no idea who she was, what she had done to deserve this fate. But he knew one thing for sure. No one deserved to die like that. He powered down the ship and gathered his equipment: water, a medical kit, his old service pistol, and a thermal blanket. There was no time to waste. The night was closing in, and with it came the scavengers, the predators that roamed the desert when darkness fell. David had to get to her before they did. He thought about his daughters as he checked his gear. Be safe, he whispered to them in his mind. But the truth was, he didn't know if he would be able to protect them this time. His resolve was solid. He had to do this. He couldn't ignore it. The plan was simple. He would approach quietly, dig her out of the sand, and bring her back to the ship. If he moved fast enough, he could be back before the predators arrived. And if he was lucky, the Verdani wouldn't notice him. But luck wasn't something David believed in. He had always made his own fate, and today was no different. His boots crunched against the dry sand as he moved toward her. The desert air felt thick, pressing down on him as he approached the burial site. The woman's body was half sunken, her breathing shallow but still alive. David's hands trembled as he dropped to his knees, pulling out the small shovel. He glanced up at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, pinpricks of light in the vast expanse above. The temperature was dropping rapidly, but David barely noticed. He dug. The sand was packed tightly around her body, and each scoop felt like a fight against time itself. His muscles burned, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The desert felt like it was swallowing them both alive, but David wasn't giving up. He couldn't leave her here. Not after everything. The sound of distant howls reached his ears, sending a chill down his spine. The predators were coming. David pushed himself harder, his heart pounding in his chest, sweat dripping down his face despite the cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he pulled her free. She was weak, barely able to stand, but her eyes, those violet eyes, were filled with gratitude. David wrapped her in his thermal cloak, lifting her into his arms. "I've got you," he said, his voice low and steady. He wasn't sure if she could hear him, but he needed her to know that she wasn't alone anymore. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he carried her back to the ship. "Thalia," she whispered. "I am Thalia Nix." David nodded, though the name meant nothing to him. She was a stranger, a woman from a species he didn't understand, but in that moment she was more than that. She was someone he had saved. And that was enough. As he made his way back to the ship, the sound of howls grew louder. The predators were closing in. But David was determined. He wouldn't let her die. Not here, not today. The transport door hissed open and David rushed inside, sealing it behind them. Thalia was safe for now, but the real fight was just beginning. The transport's engines roared to life as David slammed the door shut behind him, sealing them inside. The ship rattled with the strain of taking off, its worn metal frame groaning in protest as David pushed the throttle forward. The desert below stretched out in a sea of fading orange light, and the horizon seemed to blur as they ascended into the sky. David barely noticed the ship shuddering and rattling. His attention was fixed entirely on Thalia, still weak and trembling in his arms. Her body felt surprisingly light for someone so tall, and as David carefully lowered her onto the small medical cot in the cargo area, he noticed how fragile she seemed. Her green skin, now pale and tinged with exhaustion, shimmered slightly under the low light. Her eyes, those striking violet eyes, were closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She looked so vulnerable, so unlike the fierce, strong creature he had imagined her to be. David's hands shook as he stood over her, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't even sure how to treat an alien, but he knew enough to see that she was on the edge. She had been buried alive in the desert. Her body was dehydrated, her skin cracked from the scorching heat, and her breathing was shallow, like she was trying to hold on to her last thread of life. There wasn't much time. His daughters were waiting back at their homestead. His heart twisted with guilt, but he forced the thoughts from his mind. He couldn't think about them right now. He couldn't afford to. David pulled the medical kit from the nearby shelf and began to check Thalia's vitals. Her pulse was faint but steady. Her breathing, though shallow, was improving with each passing minute. She had survived the burial, but it would take more than a few minutes to heal the damage done. He needed to keep her stable, at least until they could reach Helios Station. He grabbed a hydration pack, carefully holding it to her lips, but she didn't respond. He hesitated for a moment, then gently tipped the pack so that the liquid trickled down her throat. Thalia's eyelids fluttered, and her violet eyes opened slowly, focusing on David's face. She looked confused, disoriented. It was clear that she was still struggling to stay conscious. Where am I?" Her voice was weak, barely a whisper, but it was enough to make David's heart skip a beat. She was alive. She was talking. "You're safe," David said softly, trying to offer some comfort, though he wasn't sure how much she could understand. "You're on my ship. We're leaving the planet." Her gaze flickered toward the ship's viewport, where the desert below was rapidly receding, replaced by the cold, empty space of Proxima's orbit. She blinked, still processing the situation. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. David nodded, though he wasn't sure what else to say. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't doing this for any grand reason. He had simply done what he felt was right, and now he was stuck with the consequences. There was no turning back. Thalia tried to sit up, her body stiff, but she winced and fell back onto the cot. I can't repay you for this," she said weakly, her eyes turning away from him almost as if she was ashamed. David's brow furrowed and he leaned in slightly, his voice soft. "You don't have to repay me. You're alive. That's enough." For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the soft hum of the ship the only sound between them. The stars outside passed in a blur, and David's thoughts began to wander. He had never thought he would be caught up in something like this. The Verdani, their brutal system, the burial rituals, it all seemed so far removed from his life, so alien. Yet here he was, saving a woman who was part of that very culture. "What happens now?" Thalia asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was stronger now, but still fragile. "Where are we going?" David took a deep breath, leaning back in his seat. "Helios Station. It's a neutral station. We'll find supplies and then figure out what to do next." Thalia's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. "You shouldn't have saved me," she said quietly. "You know what the Verdani will do to you, to your family. You'll be marked as a criminal, a traitor. They'll hunt you." David didn't flinch. He had heard all of this before. The danger. The consequences. But he had already made his decision. There was no going back. "I've lived my life doing what's easy, and it hasn't been enough. This is something different. Maybe the Verdani will hunt me down, but they can't take away the fact that I did what was right." Thalia studied him for a long moment. Her violet eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, wonder, maybe both. Finally she spoke again, her voice softer. "You humans, you really are different." David shrugged, though there was a hint of pride in his eyes. "Maybe we're not so different from the rest of you. We just have to believe that there's more to life than what we're told. That's all." Thalia didn't respond right away. Instead, she closed her eyes, clearly exhausted from the ordeal. David let her rest. He had to focus now. There was no telling how long they would have before the Verdani came after them. The heat from the desert had faded, but the danger was still very much real. He glanced at the ship's console, checking their course. The trip to Helios Station would take a few hours, but he would need to be on high alert. There was no guarantee that they wouldn't be intercepted before they reached neutral ground. His thoughts shifted to his daughters. He had left them back home, told them to stay put and lock the doors. But he had no idea what was waiting for them when he got back. He couldn't afford to think about that now. He had to keep Thalia safe. She was his responsibility, and he wasn't about to let her die. Not again. As the ship drifted further from Proxima, David's thoughts turned toward the future. He didn't know what it held. He didn't know what would happen when the Verdani caught up with him, or how long they could hide. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this world, his daughter's world, be defined by fear and cruelty. Not anymore. He looked down at Thalia, her breathing steady now, her face relaxed in sleep. For the first time in a long while, David allowed himself a moment of peace. He had made his choice. And no matter what happened next, he would stand by it. They were both in this together now. David eased back into the pilot's seat, his hands gripping the controls with a tense resolve. The hum of the ship filled the cabin, but the silence between him and Thalia spoke louder than any engine noise. The ship's interior was small and cramped, but there was no space for hesitation. As the stars streaked past the viewport, David stole a glance at the figure lying on the medical cot behind him. Thalia's delicate form, wrapped in the thermal cloak he had given her, lay motionless, her breath steady but shallow. She was asleep, or at least she appeared to be. But David knew better than to trust appearances. He had seen what dehydration and trauma could do to a person. She needed rest, but she also needed more than just the few hours of peace he could offer her. If she had any chance of survival, he needed to get her medical help before it was too late. But he also had his daughters to think about. As the ship glided silently through the void of space, David's mind kept drifting back to his three girls, Lily, Selena, and Melanie. He could still hear their voices, their innocent questions as he had left the homestead hours ago. "When will you be back, Daddy?" Lily had asked, her small hands clutching his shirt, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Will you bring us something nice from space?" David had smiled at the time, a weak, strained smile that had hidden the guilt gnawing at his chest. "I'll be back soon, Starshine," he had promised, though deep down he wasn't sure when or even if he'd be able to keep that promise. What if the Verdani find me? What if I don't make it back? David's fingers tightened on the controls, fighting back the wave of dread that threatened to consume him. He couldn't think about that now. He had made his decision. He had already crossed a line and there was no turning back. His daughters, his only reason for holding on to life, would have to understand that what he was doing now wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up for something bigger. The door to the cabin slid open and David turned in his seat, his heart leaping into his throat as Thalia's voice broke the silence. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice still raspy from the dehydration but stronger than before. She was awake now, propped up against the edge of the cot, her violet eyes locking onto David's with quiet intensity. David gave her a tired smile, trying to hide the fatigue that threatened to overwhelm him. "We're heading for Helios Station," he said, his voice steady. "It's a neutral zone. We'll get some supplies and then figure out our next move." Thalia's eyes narrowed as she processed his words. "You shouldn't have done this," she said softly, but there was no accusation in her voice, only the quiet sorrow of someone who had accepted the harshness of her fate. "If the Verdani find out you helped me, they'll execute you. And your family will be in danger too. I won't allow you to sacrifice them for me." David shook his head, his jaw tightening. He wasn't sure what Thalia expected him to say. What could he possibly say to someone who had been condemned to die by the very people who held power over her? She was right, of course. The Verdani would not hesitate to kill him for this. But the truth was, he had already made that choice. And for the first time in months, he had felt something beyond fear and grief. Purpose. "Maybe I am," David replied, his voice soft but firm. "Maybe I'm sacrificing everything. But I'm not going to stand by and let you die like that. You deserve better than this, than them. You deserve a chance." A shadow passed over Thalia's face, but she didn't look away from him. Instead, she seemed to consider his words, her gaze searching his face for something she wasn't quite sure she could trust. Humans don't think like we do," she said finally, her voice faint but tinged with awe. "You throw yourselves into danger without thinking of the consequences. You risk everything, your lives, your families, for a stranger you barely know. It's impossible to understand." She paused, her lips twitching slightly as if she were trying to find the right words. "And yet it's beautiful." David couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. He was starting to understand her better now. The complexity beneath her alien appearance, the quiet strength she carried with her despite the brutality of her own society. There was something tragic about Thalia, something that spoke of a life far more complicated than her society had allowed her to live. David sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't used to talking to people like this, especially not strangers from other worlds. But something about Thalia's presence felt like a pull he couldn't resist. "I don't know about beautiful," he said, his voice low, "but I do know one thing. I'm not going to leave you out here to die. I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't let that happen, no matter the cost." Thalia fell silent, her eyes drifting down to her hands which lay limp in her lap. She looked almost defeated. But then, as if gathering the last of her strength, she met his gaze again. "You think this is a choice?" she asked quietly. "You think you're doing this because it's right? You're wrong, David Kaine. You're doing this because you don't know what else to do." David was about to respond when the proximity alarm blared, cutting through the cabin's tense atmosphere like a knife. His heart skipped a beat as he whipped around to glance at the console. The sensors were picking up something. Something big. "Verdani's ship," he muttered under his breath as he began to punch in commands, calculating their trajectory. "They're on our tail." Talia's face turned pale as the sound of the Verdani ship's engines filled the cabin, growing louder by the second. "They found us." David cursed and gripped the controls harder. He was still in range of Proxima Theis's gravitational field, and their chances of slipping past the Verdani undetected were slim to none. If they didn't act fast, they would be caught, and everything he had done would have been for nothing. "They won't stop until they find me," Talia said, her voice a sharp edge. "You're putting your children in danger. You need to get them out of here." David glanced at her, his face hardening. "You think I don't know that?" he snapped, his voice barely controlled. "I didn't ask for any of this, but I'll be damned if I let you die for something you didn't choose." Talia looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we fight. But you need to make it count." David's eyes flashed with determination as the Verdani ship loomed closer. He didn't have time to waste. They were running out of options, and it was time to make his move. The chase was on, and he wasn't going down without a fight. "Buckle up," he ordered, his fingers moving swiftly over the controls. "We're not done yet." Talia steadied herself, her eyes narrowing as she too prepared for what was coming. The stakes had just been raised, and David knew they were about to face something far worse than anything he had ever encountered. But as the ship jolted forward, cutting through the stars, David held on to one thought. He wasn't going to lose this fight. Not now. The proximity alarm blared again, the shrill sound slicing through the cabin, making David's blood run cold. The Verdani ship was closer now, too close. His fingers danced over the controls, pushing the ship faster as the stars stretched into lines of light outside the viewport. His breath came in shallow bursts, his mind calculating their next move with the same precision he had used in countless dangerous situations. But this wasn't like anything he had faced before. The ship groaned as it rocketed through space, the aging engines protesting with every turn, every sharp correction. David ignored the feedback, his eyes locked on the navigation display, scanning for a safe course through the asteroid belt that lay ahead. It was their best chance. If they could navigate it quickly and carefully enough, the dense field of asteroids might give them enough cover to escape the Verdani patrol. But it was a dangerous gamble. Behind him, Talia was silent, her body tense, every muscle alert as she watched him work. David had no idea what was going through her mind. She had been through so much already: betrayal, burial, escape, and now her life depended on the choices he made. His choices. "David?" Talia's voice cut through the tension, low but steady. "You don't have to do this. You could just drop me off somewhere, Helios Station or any neutral zone, and let them find me. You could save yourself." David's jaw clenched as he glanced at her over his shoulder. He had already made that decision before he even knew her name, before he fully understood the risk. It wasn't just about saving her. It was about standing up to the Verdani, to the oppressive system that had condemned her.
"I'm not leaving you behind," he replied firmly, not looking away from the console. "We're in this together now. I'll get us out of here." Talia's violet eyes flickered with something. Maybe relief, maybe something else, but she said nothing more. David could feel the weight of her gaze on his back as he continued to pilot the ship through the stars, weaving between the massive asteroids, hoping that the Verdani ship would be too slow to follow. Minutes passed, each one stretching into eternity. The asteroid field loomed closer, massive rocks floating in space, casting dark shadows over the empty void. David calculated the trajectory, adjusting their course slightly to avoid the largest obstacles. He could feel the pulse of the ship beneath him, every vibration reminding him of how fragile their escape truly was. "Hold on," he muttered to himself as he swung the ship hard to the left, dodging a massive asteroid that appeared out of nowhere. The transport jolted violently, its frame creaking as it fought to stay together. The sudden movement sent a sharp pain through his shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and pushed the pain away. They couldn't afford mistakes now. Not when their lives hung in the balance. Behind him, he could hear Talia's soft, strained breath, her voice rising above the noise of the ship. David, we can't outrun them forever. They'll catch us. They always catch those who defy them. David's grip tightened on the controls. Her words were heavy, filled with the cold reality of the situation. He knew the Verdani. They didn't let anyone escape. And yet, David couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was giving him the strength to keep going. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about making sure her sacrifice meant something. About showing her, and himself, that humans could defy the odds, could stand up even against the might of an entire civilization. We don't have forever, David said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. But we're going to make it. I promise. He pushed the throttle again, speeding through the asteroid field with all the agility his old transport could muster. The ship screeched under the strain, its worn hull groaning with every violent maneuver. But they were gaining ground. The Verdani ship was falling behind, unable to match their speed in the treacherous asteroid field. David's heart pounded as the field narrowed. He could see the distant flash of light from the Verdani ship's engines behind them, growing dimmer as they sped farther into the dark, uncharted expanse of space. He dared a glance at the rearview sensor. The Verdani were still in pursuit, but barely. Just a little longer, David muttered under his breath, his eyes flickering over the console, locking in their coordinates. And then, out of nowhere, the ship shuddered, its left engine sputtering as a sudden jolt ran through the cabin. David's stomach dropped as the control panel lit up in flashing red. The Verdani had fired on them. Damn it! David cursed under his breath, trying to regain control. The left engine was failing. He could feel it in the ship's lurching movements. They weren't going to make it if they didn't fix it now. David, they're catching up, Talia said, her voice low and tight with panic. He didn't have time to answer her. His mind was already working overtime, calculating their options. His fingers moved across the console, trying to stabilize the ship, but the damage was too severe. There was only one choice left. He'd have to engage the emergency thrusters and force their way through the rest of the asteroid field. He glanced over his shoulder, meeting Talia's eyes one last time. Hang on, he said, his voice grim. Without waiting for a response, David flipped a switch, engaging the emergency thrusters. The ship surged forward, jolting violently as the thrusters kicked in, pushing them faster than they had gone before. The ship screamed in protest, the metal frame groaning, but David's hands remained steady, guiding them through the tight spaces between asteroids. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down, each asteroid passing in front of them like a wall of stone. Then, the ship lurched again, and David knew they had made it through the worst of the field. The Verdani were still behind them. But now, they were too far out of range. The asteroid field had bought them enough time. David's pulse began to slow as he glanced at the navigation screen. We've lost them, he said, his voice shaking with relief. But there was no time to celebrate. The Verdani ship wasn't far behind. They would regroup. They would keep coming. David punched in the new course, setting their destination to the farthest reach of the Proxima system. They had to get to the edge, to Helios Station, where they could disappear into the hustle and bustle of neutral territory. But even there, they wouldn't be safe forever. We'll make it, David said quietly, almost as much to himself as to Talia. We have to. Talia's voice came from behind him, softer this time, but filled with something David hadn't heard before, hope. I didn't think humans could fight like this, she said. But you're not just running from them. You're fighting back. David let out a shaky breath. Sometimes you have to fight to stay alive. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time since he'd made the decision to rescue Talia, David felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting. For her, for his daughters, and for the future they could still have, no matter how impossible it seemed. The stars stretched out before them, and David steeled himself for the next step. He was ready for whatever came next. The ship drifted in the quiet of space, the hum of its engines the only sound in the cabin. For a brief moment, David allowed himself to relax, but he knew better. The Verdani ship was still out there, likely regrouping for another attempt. They'd bought time by escaping the asteroid field, but the danger wasn't over. Not yet. His fingers danced over the controls, guiding the ship steadily toward their next waypoint. He had plotted a course for Helios Station, the neutral zone he hoped would provide temporary refuge. But the closer they got, the more he felt the weight of the decision he had made pressing down on him. He had already risked everything for Talia, and for the first time since Elena's death, he didn't feel regret. But there was something he couldn't shake, something that tugged at the back of his mind. Talia. She had been so quiet since they had escaped, her body still recovering from the desert's brutal punishment. He could see her now, sitting silently on the cot behind him, her face turned toward the window as if lost in thought. Her green skin had regained some of its vibrancy, though it still appeared frail. Her violet eyes were filled with something more than exhaustion now, something darker, more intense. David wasn't sure how much of her story she had told him, or how much of her past she had buried deep within herself. The little he knew about the Verdani was grim, and he couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her to live in a society that punished its own for something as fundamental as infertility. But there was more to this than just a woman trying to escape a cruel system. David had seen enough in his life to know that there were layers to every story, layers that didn't always make themselves apparent at first glance. Talia's voice broke the silence, low but clear. "You don't know everything about me, David." David's heart skipped a beat, and he slowly turned around, meeting her gaze for the first time since the ship had left Proxima. There was something different about her, something that told him this was no longer just about survival. She had made up her mind to reveal something, and David wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. "Tell me," he said, his voice steady, though his mind raced. Talia sat up a little straighter, her fingers curling around the edge of the cot. "I didn't just escape because of what they did to me. There's more. Much more." David's breath caught in his chest. The weight of her words pressed on him, heavy and thick, like a storm about to break. He couldn't imagine what else she was holding back, but he had a feeling it was something that would change everything. "I wasn't just condemned for infertility," Talia continued, her eyes never leaving his. "That's the official story. The one the Verdani want the rest of the galaxy to believe. The truth is, they buried me because I found something. Something they didn't want anyone to know." David's mind churned, but he didn't interrupt her. He just nodded, urging her to continue. He had learned over the years that sometimes people had to talk, even if it meant reliving the worst parts of their lives. "I'm not just some failed genetic experiment, David. I'm not just a victim," Talia said, her voice soft but firm. "I was a scientist. A geneticist, to be exact. I worked for the Verdani's reproductive sciences division. My job was to study the genetic manipulation programs they had in place. At first, it was just routine work. But then, I found something. Something that made me realize everything they told us was a lie." David's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about one woman trying to escape punishment. This was something much bigger. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Talia took a deep breath, her shoulders stiffening as if the weight of the confession was finally bearing down on her. "The Verdani have been manipulating our genetic code for centuries. They've been controlling fertility, not through natural means, but through engineered genetics. They've been selecting who gets to reproduce and who doesn't. They've been creating an artificial caste system, deciding who is allowed to have children and who isn't based on bloodlines, social status, and fertility." David's mind spun. That's impossible." Talia shook her head. "It's not impossible. It's systematic. And it's been happening for generations. What I found was evidence that they've been genetically altering our population, creating artificial divides, removing fertility from certain families while enhancing it in others. They've been controlling us from the inside out." David felt his breath catch in his throat. He had never imagined anything like this. A genetic caste system. A system that made life itself a matter of manipulation and control. The thought sickened him. "That's why I was buried in the desert." Talia continued, her voice tight with emotion. "I found out about it. I was going to expose the truth. But they couldn't allow that. Not when everything they've built is based on that lie. I threatened everything. Their power, their control. So, they buried me, hoping I would die out there in the sand. But I didn't." David's eyes widened as the enormity of what she was saying sank in. This wasn't just about an alien woman trying to escape her fate. This was about a secret that could bring down an entire civilization. A truth so dangerous that it had cost her everything. "You were going to expose them?" David said, his voice rough with disbelief. You were going to tell the galaxy what they've been doing all along. Talia nodded slowly, her face hardening with resolve. I couldn't let them continue to control us. I couldn't live with myself knowing what they were doing to my people, to the next generation. It wasn't just a question of fertility. It was a question of freedom. They've been enslaving us, David, in ways we couldn't even see. David sat back, his mind reeling. And now they'll come after you. After both of us. Talia's eyes softened as she looked at him. They'll come after everyone who helped me. But this isn't just about me anymore. This is about something bigger than the Verdani. Something that could change everything. You risked everything to save me. You have to know, David, what you're protecting. It's not just my life. It's the truth. And if we can get it out there, it could free my people. It could free the entire Verdani society. David's chest tightened. He had always known that his actions would have consequences. But this was something else entirely. What he was holding wasn't just a fugitive anymore. It was a revolution. Then we have to make sure they don't stop us, he said, his voice steady, despite the weight of the truth now sitting heavy in his chest. We'll keep going. We'll make sure the truth gets out. Talia met his gaze, her eyes burning with the same fierce determination that now gripped his heart. We will. Together. David nodded, his hands steady on the controls. They weren't just escaping anymore. They were fighting for something bigger. And whatever came next, he wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The ship hummed steadily, its engines purring beneath the floor as it cruised deeper into the uncharted reaches of space. The stars outside twinkled like pinpricks in the velvet void, distant and cold. David's fingers drummed lightly on the controls, the rhythmic tapping betraying the tension that still coiled in his chest. Helios Station was within their grasp now, just a few hours away. The small, neutral zone was known for its bustling trade routes, a haven for those who needed to disappear, humans, aliens, rebels, and smugglers alike. It was a perfect place for them to lay low for a while, find new supplies, and formulate a plan. But that calm, temporary sanctuary felt like an illusion. The Verdani were still out there, their ships hunting the stars for Talia and anyone associated with her. They would stop at nothing to silence her, to bury the truth that could unravel their entire system. They knew she was alive now. It was only a matter of time before they found her, and when they did, they would make her pay for what she had uncovered. And if they couldn't get to her, they would come for the next best thing, David and his daughters. David couldn't shake the thought, and it gnawed at him like a constant, bitter itch. His daughters. They had been safe at the homestead, isolated from the rest of the galaxy's chaos. But now, with his choice to rescue Talia, everything had changed. He had put them in harm's way. Even if they reached Helios, even if they found a safe place to hide, he knew they wouldn't be safe forever. Talia's voice broke through his thoughts. We're almost there, she said, her tone soft but tinged with a quiet urgency. David didn't look back at her. He could hear the weariness in her voice. The truth she had shared, the truth that she had uncovered, had already changed her. But it had changed him, too. Her fight had become his fight. I know, he replied, his voice firm, though the weight of the situation sat heavy in his chest. He had made his promise to her. They would protect the truth. They would see it through. But he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was coming, something bigger than he could control. David, Talia continued, her voice a little shakier now, I've been thinking. David's brow furrowed. He could hear the weight of her words. It was rare for her to pause, to hesitate. It made him uneasy. I've been thinking about my people, she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. About what you said, about standing up to them. I know I can't go back. Not to the Verdani, not to their society. It's broken beyond repair. Her words were punctuated with a bitter laugh, but it held no humor, just resignation. David's hands tightened on the ship's controls. He wasn't sure what she was getting at, but he knew this conversation was one they couldn't avoid. They were on the edge now. There was no turning back. The Verdani can't go on like this, she continued. Their system, their laws. It's all built on control, on manipulation. It's not just about me. It's about all of them. The ones who can't fight back, the ones who don't have a voice. I could help them. I could bring change. David turned slightly in his seat to face her. She was sitting up now, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to hold the weight of the universe behind them. He could see the fire in her gaze, the same fire he had seen in his daughters when they had learned to stand up for what was right. Do you really believe that? He asked, his voice hoarse. Talia's lips pressed together, and for a moment, she was silent. Then, slowly, she nodded. I have to believe it. If I don't, I'm no better than the rest of them. No better than the system that buried me. David stared at her for a long moment, taking in the quiet strength that radiated from her. She had been through so much, yet here she was, fighting for something bigger than herself. I don't know if I can help you with that, David said, the words heavy in his chest. But I'll be damned if I leave you to fight it alone. Talia's lips curled up into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. I wouldn't want you to, she said softly. But you'll need to make a choice. Because this isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about changing something. It's about bringing down a system that's been in place for centuries. David nodded slowly, a sense of understanding beginning to settle in his bones. He had already made a choice when he decided to rescue her, when he decided to fight back. But now, he had a new realization. This wasn't just about getting her to safety. This was about taking a stand, about finding a way to expose the truth and make sure it reached the people who needed it most. We'll figure it out, David said quietly, more to himself than to Talia. We have to. The ship hummed as it entered the last stretch of its journey. Helios Station loomed in the distance, its sprawling docks and commercial hubs beginning to take shape against the stars. But David knew that even as they approached safety, the fight wasn't over. The Verdani would come. He was certain of it. But this time, he would be ready. David's hand tightened around the controls, and as the ship drew closer to the station, a sense of resolve settled over him. He wasn't just running anymore. He wasn't just surviving. This was the beginning of something much bigger. And whatever happened next, he would face it head on. Because if there was one thing he had learned from Talia, it was that sometimes the only way to break free was to tear down the walls that bound you and build something new in its place. The station's docking bay was just ahead, but as the ship slid toward its final destination, David couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was still to come, and they would fight it together